Hey everyone, welcome to episode 23 of Business Therapy. I'm Sam, and today I'm joined by Heidi. She's making a return to the podcast as
Again.
Jonathan has had to call out last moment. So we're very grateful that she's been able to join us this week for the conversation. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all our weekly topics and discussions. Today we're going to be talking about funding. Do we get funding? Do we deny funding? What are the implications of that? I know this is a really hot topic for a lot of people out there who are starting businesses, but even in businesses who maybe have been around for a few years, private or public, and they're looking for cash infusions for the various reasons. So we don't want to overly target maybe the startup community, although I know that's kind of where the funding conversation often is most relevant. And I know, well, maybe we'll start with you, Heidi, since you've actually been part of accelerator programs. And I know that you've had a lot of exposure to trying to get funding, having funding conversations, seeing the effects of people being funded, people not being funded. I guess maybe start with your general experience around this.
Sure. Yeah. So I can talk about my experience and then my thoughts on the experience. With my first startup, Crowd Lobby, about 5 years ago, we started looking for funding for the first time. So that was the first time, we put together the business plan, I put together a pitch deck. And I think like a lot of first time entrepreneurs, I really was just told like, this is the way this goes. Like you put together your materials and then you just try and go out in the world and find somebody to fund it. And I think Silicon Valley and a lot of the movies we've seen have really kind of really dove into this narrative. Yeah. So, I mean, I think when we think about the startup experience, this is what we think of. It's like, you have this brilliant idea and then a billionaire investor is like, here's $100 million, like, go do it, do something amazing. The reality, I think for most of us is much more of a slog. My first experience, so we did have some alternative modes of funding, which I do think are important to talk about. So like Sam mentioned, we went through an accelerator program. They gave us $20,000 with no strings attached. So that was just like, here's $20,000 to help your business. We did a Kickstarter campaign. So we raised, I think, $35,000 from friends and family. So, I mean, in some way that is a sizable amount. And it was from our personal networks. So we did have alternative modes of funding, but what we realized after about a year and a half of pretty aggressively seeking funding was that it probably wasn't coming. And then we were going to have to pivot and figure out how to make our business work without that kind of funding. And I think that is the more entrepreneurs that I meet and the more that you read about this, the more you realize that is really the traditional journey. And I think one that a lot more entrepreneurs should prepare themselves for. And I'm happy to dive into all of it, but I do kind of, again, want to set the stage. I was just looking at this before we hopped on. I think everybody has heard a lot of the same statistics about, I think it's like 50% of businesses fail in the first year and something like 80% fail in the first 5 years. But also 80% of small businesses are self-funded. And then even beyond that, most of them are bank loans, taking out personal loans, things like that. So I think it's really important to caveat this conversation by saying most people in the entrepreneurial space are not dealing with some, millionaire, billionaire investor who's just pumping money into their business. I think, obviously it's necessary to talk about because it is a business model, but it's not the business model that most entrepreneurs actually face. And so I think that, took me 2 years to learn, but now it's something that I wish, I'm always trying to tell entrepreneurs, like, don't expect $10 million to walk in the door.
Yeah, or anyone really. I mean, again, making it more broad to people who are not even, maybe who are businesses who are 5-10 years in, anyone looking for funding. It's not going to be as easy as reaching out for massive amounts of funds from angel investors, from private equity partners. I mean, it's the stories you hear about for some of these bigger deals, but I think you make a really strong point around it's not the average. It's not the average transaction. People aren't doling out huge allotments of money and just gambling on things. It's not. There is a little of that going on, but it's by far a minute percentage of the actual business transactions that are going around stable businesses that are growing, they're bootstrapping, or businesses that are proving success iteratively, businesses that are a little more stable or less innovative or less maybe experimental. I mean, there's tons of, the majority of business activity is coming from more stable sources of funding.
Yeah, and I think that kind of a common misconception with this is oftentimes so many entrepreneurs, and I was one of them, will say like, well, the only way I could do this is with, $1 million, or the only way I could really test this theory is with $5 million. And some of that is true. Like there are certain, if you're a entrepreneur or a business that requires a patent, if you're an entrepreneur that requires really intense research materials. So there are niche things that really do require a sizable upfront investment. But I think for a lot of us, it's become, again, the Silicon Valley narrative of like, well, the only way I can test this is build $1 million app and have $1 million team and just like take it to the people. And the reality is that's not really the case. Most businesses can have a much, much smaller MVP. The amount of people that reach out to me and say like, well, I want to build an app. And I'm like, okay, but have you tried your idea first? Have you launched like a free website or, got a Facebook group together? And most of the time the answer is no. And so I think part of this narrative is this idea of like, the only way you can test something is by throwing $1 million at it and then we'll see if it sticks. And I not only would disagree with that premise, but I also think, again, the percentage of people that actually get that chance and actually get to go play with a couple $1 million and just see if their idea works is in the minority.
Yeah, they're kind of the upper echelon or the superstars who, I think a lot of that too is, so for some people who are very wealthy, a few $1 million is kind of like, an average person saying, I'm going to take $10,000 and try an idea. And when you think about it and the relativity of that, then that can make sense. I mean, because when you have that kind of wealth, you can buy more expensive things, you can take more expensive risks. But for the majority of people, it's all about self-awareness, I think, of where you are, what you're trying to achieve, and what your network looks like. And I think your point about the funding, it brings me to, well, let me start here, because if it hasn't become apparent, I think you and I are somewhat aligned on funding is not even if it's available to you, be careful with it. And I'd say I'm generally anti getting funded. Now, that doesn't mean I'm anti getting a bank loan or trying to take out a reasonable loan from family and friends to try something or to help your business get through a sticky cash flow situation or whatever. So funding is kind of a broad topic. I think the real thing about funding is it's not a more money is better mentality, is really what I want to convey. It's, you have a certain amount of need for a business at a certain part of its life cycle. And everyone needs to be, or my advisement would be to be more conscious about what that is. What are you? Are you a baby? Are you mature? What's going on in the marketplace? It's not always a good thing. It can be a very toxic thing to take on funding if you're not ready or you don't really understand the implications of that, because money is energy and the energy has to come from somewhere, and the energy always has to be managed. And especially, I guess I would like to make an analogy, I guess, on that point, which is if you're, let's say, I don't know, churning milk into butter, or let's just think about something that takes time. I mean, you can either take the time and do it yourself. You can maybe just buy butter if you had the money to buy it, or you could pay somebody to come and churn it for you. But either way, it's got to happen somehow. It's not like somebody giving you the money to buy it without you doing the work means that the work wasn't done somewhere along the way. It's energy is energy is energy. So I don't know, maybe this is getting more convoluted as I'm trying to go through it. But like when you're asking for funding, you're basically just getting an energy infusion. It's not going to cheat the work that you have to do to make your business grow, or the work has to be done somewhere.
Yeah. And I think part of this that the investment world, in my experience, is starting to come to terms with is a lot of that, like, where's that line, is whether or not you've interacted with the market or not. Again, I think we've all seen the movies where it goes from idea to, conception to launch because of a giant investor. But the reality is most investors are getting pretty smart to pay attention and say like, look, I want to see that this actually has a customer. I want to see that this has interacted with the market. I want to see that, even if it's on a teeny tiny scale, like for every dollar, the perfect example is like, if you can show me that for every dollar I put into this business, you're going to make $2, even if you've only put in $50 and made $100, you've at least interacted with the market. And, of course, whether or not that's going to scale that way is a question that you as a business would have to figure out. But I think, again, this idea of I'm going to walk in with an idea and then somebody's just going to kind of pay me to test it out is, I think, one that the investing space is getting more and more careful about not jumping into. And again, like Sam said, it depends on your network. I mean, if you're sitting here and you've got like a killer network full of people just waiting to give their money around, I mean, there are people in those scenarios. And for those people, like, hell yeah, there's a lot of ideas that I'd love to test out. And if somebody would give me the money. But again, I think for the average entrepreneur who's got an idea and is thinking like, oh, do I want to go after this? Do I want to, maybe consider this? I think realizing that, look, spending the first 2 years trying to get somebody to cough up $100 million or $1 million probably makes a heck of a lot less sense than just really trying to figure out, like, how can I start interacting with the market, even if it's with one customer, 5 customers, 100 customers. So.
And that what you're talking about is what I'm desperately trying to articulate from different angles. That lean startup mentality that you're talking about, which is that whole thing swept the market. And it's really built on sound process principles, which is build a very small minimum viable product, test its efficacy, make sure that the market says this is good and this could go somewhere, and iterate. You have to start small and you have to go through your paces and iterate. In a way, the entire funding mentality is counter culture to that, which is to say you can get a massive cash infusion or even a modest cash infusion beyond what you've already tested at the smallest scale possible you could extract from the marketplace. And you could somehow maybe start in the middle of an iterative cycle. And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, because if you can't test your product from idea to like very small and have 1 customer and then 10 customers, then 100 customers, the arguments are thin a lot of the times that, well, we actually need to start with 1,000 customers before we can prove anything out to you. Or a lot of companies that have these models of, we need massive investment to build a market on this side and then build a market on this side to see the product working. There's really not a lot of, in my experience, there's not a lot of models, no matter what the story is, that couldn't be proved out at a very small level, even if it's just in a test environment. And that's part of doing the work. It's part of growing as a business and proving out that your idea can take physical form and continue to build itself stronger over time. I don't see a lot of people out there that it doesn't matter if you can't do that at step 1, if you can't get it out the door and get 1 person to look at it and say, yeah, this is good, getting money, getting funding, taking other people's energy to try to help you get past that first step, it rarely yields the results.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it is, I mean, there's definitely a culture of like low risk. I think a lot of, especially young entrepreneurs, and I was certainly one of them, if you had asked me in the beginning of my journey, like, hey, are you willing to take everything in your bank account and put it up on the line for this? I think quite frankly, my answer would have been like, absolutely not. Like, I don't know if this is going to work. But I think, for most of history, that's pretty much how it worked. If you wanted to start a business and you really believed in an idea, you have to figure out, like, you have to put some skin in the game. And I want to caveat that by saying there's another extreme. I've also ran into lots of entrepreneurs that say, like, I leveraged my house and I have, $100,000 worth of credit card debt, and like, I'm worried about my family. That makes me also wildly uncomfortable, because like that, I mean, good on you to believe in yourself, but there are sustainable ways of doing this. But again, I think there's a little bit of a middle ground there where saying like, hey, I want somebody to take all the risk and I want to be able to walk away 6 months from now having lost $1 million and like, clean my hands of it and walk away and do something else, probably means you haven't put enough skin in the game. And so I think that's also a question for a lot of people that are in the beginning of this journey to ask, which is like, again, do you want to take out $50,000 worth of credit card debt? No, please don't. But are you willing to, put some of your own funds, put some of your own time to prove that the model works? I think a lot of that is really necessary before you get to the funding. And I think, quite frankly, I think a lot of entrepreneurs burn out before that. They spend a year or 2 and they really go after the funding hard and they focus all their attention on that. And then they're like, okay, forget it. I'm going to go back to my day job. And the entrepreneurs that stick around and say like, all right, like, putting everything into this and it's been a year and then it's been a 2 and it's been 3. I mean, I just heard about a company yesterday. They've been around for like 5 years and they just got like their first big $2 million fund. And, this guy knows everything about his industry. He's put everything into it. He does it day in and day out. And finally, somebody recognized that. It was like, hey, you obviously know what you're doing. Now I want to put money into it. But I think that's a much more natural cycle. But again, it's not really the like 0 to 1,000 journey that we're constantly all promised when we talk about the entrepreneurial hero's journey.
Yeah. Well, and also the journey or the decision to get funded in a situation or not, the process of it. I mean, if I put it to most people, if I told you had to work 1,000 hours in a row and then you get this massive $1,000 payout, Or I gave you a situation where you could work 1,000 hours for $1 an hour. That's kind of a lot of what the mentality. And for some people, it just sounds much more menial and grueling and mundane to work the 1,000 hours to get $1 an hour. Versus if I said, oh, at the end of this 1,000 hours, I'm going to give you $1,000. Obviously, $1,000 is not like shiny to anybody. Maybe I should have used $1 million or $2 million. But the point is that in that math, if you think about the process, you're working all the same. Startup people work. It's not like you're in your basement eating ramen. All of a sudden, somebody gives you $1 million, or a bank will give you a major loan if you think you're going to get funded. There's work that goes into pitching. There's work that goes into acquiring that money. And the point is, if you would just, it's sort of the idea, if you could do the work and make very small amounts incrementally, you're going to get to the same place. It's that kind of idea that energy is energy in a way. And it may not always be completely comparable, but if you actually watch how hard people work to get funded and to go out and pitch and to kind of work that gamble, a lot of times it ends up being a wash. And you would say, actually, if it was work 1,000 hours and get $1,000 at the end, or work 1,000 hours for $1 an hour, financial wisdom actually says to do the latter, because you're actually making the money incrementally, and then you have more flexibility. You can do stuff with it. It's actually wouldn't be advised in those two situations to go for the big payout, because then you have nothing in between. There's no cash flow. So again, it's this idea that not only is funding people think, oh, we're going to get this big infusion of cash quick, no matter where it's coming from. They tend to dismiss the process it takes to acquire it, the work and the opportunity cost. Where could that energy have been spent if it was spent in someplace else for that same time period, for that same goal?
And I think what we're kind of circling around over and over again is, what does the actual entrepreneurial journey look like? And I think the reality is it's probably very far from what I think a lot of people imagine. Shark Tank, Silicon Valley, a lot of these shows, and again, a lot of the true Silicon Valley, the Facebooks, the Amazons, a lot of these stories were what they were, and they do involve a lot of funding and a lot of like crazy encounters, but they're not the majority of the entrepreneurial space. And I think, again, really speaking to that fact that if you're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur and starting your own thing, recognizing that there's a grind, and there's I always joke, like, the people who stick around are the people who are willing to get punched in the face and then get up the next day and be like, whew, okay, I think everything might fail, but we're going to go ahead and try this again. And, people do it for different reasons. Some people do it because there's a chance that they might make a ton of money. Other people do it because they love the freedom and the flexibility. I would put myself probably in that category. I just like being my own boss and having my own time and, being able to set my own schedule. Some people do it because they have like a super passion project. They're like, I have to work on this thing because it's like all, it's what I think about day and night. So I think people do it for different reasons, but I think, again, being realistic and recognizing that what you see on TV, what you read, what we, intuitively think of when we think about all the billionaires and the guys who have, made it big in this country, realistically, if you're thinking about that journey, the questions that you want to be asking yourself are less about, can I pitch a millionaire and do I have like a, $1 billion network? And probably more about like, hey, am I ready to get up for 365 days in a row and have everybody tell me this isn't going to work and like get up and do it anyway? Or am I willing to try something 365 different ways and see which one works? Or am I willing to go talk to 365 people and get feedback on what I should and shouldn't be doing? So I think it's just a lot more. And I mean, there's so many books that have been written about this. The first one that comes to mind is Grit. But I think it's just changing that narrative of saying like the entrepreneurial journey is a lot more of a slog than I think a lot of what, the media has probably presented it to be.
Well, that's certainly true. And to keep up with my lame analogy, the question you have to ask yourself is,
are we going back to churning butter?
Do you want to churn the butter? Or do you want to be the person who's just seen holding the butter? I mean, it's the real question, because somebody's got to do the work. That's like you're saying, the entrepreneurial journey is, or really the journey for any business person is, are you enjoying the process? Because if you can't enjoy the process to get your business to get funds, and you'd rather just go out and get funds, then maybe you should work in getting funds. It's like, do you want to buy the butter and be taking a picture holding the butter, or do you want to churn the butter? If you want butter, then you may as well just churn the butter yourself. If you don't want to, then buy it somewhere else. But they're different activities with different objectives and different goals in mind. Well,
and this is like when I started my first business, you asked me, I was probably, 6 months maybe into this journey. And you said, hey, if your business fails in 5 years and nothing comes of it, would you still do it? And that was probably one of the harder questions I've ever had to ask myself. And I ask myself that every day now, because I think, again, so many people in this space are just killing themselves, either emotionally, physically. They, again, $100,000 worth of debt, putting their family underwater. I mean, you see it constantly. And I think a lot of people do it with this idea of, like you said, I'm gonna work 1,000 days and then I'm gonna get a payout at the end, but they hate every step of it. And like all things in life, I would say, if you don't actually like it in the present, go do something else. Now, again, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to love like filling out your accounting or, every single minute. But at the end of the day, if you can't really be like, look, I love this process, this like really jazzes me up and I enjoy it, go find something else to do. And I think that's where, again, if the entrepreneurial journey was more about like people who love what they do, again, because they're passionate about it, because they like the flexibility, because they like being their own boss, because, whatever it happens to be, I think that would be a much more organic cycle than what we currently have, which is like you're a slave to investors or you're a slave to, your job for 10 years. And then maybe you'll be the next Mark Zuckerberg, which, in my opinion and my experience, and honestly, the data shows this, leads to a lot of really unhappy entrepreneurs. There's a lot of anxiety, stress, depression, mental health issues in the entrepreneurial community. And I think it's because a lot of people fall into this trap.
And that comes back to the topic of being mindful and being present with it. And it's not very attractive with the going conventions you just talked about, because a lot of people are trained and they really do think work hard, push through the bad stuff to get the payout, whether it be your business, whether it be getting funded, whatever it is. And by my account, and like you just kind of mentioned, and I think you reiterated, if you're not happy in the present, it's not going to be sustainable. So you may as well shelve it and do something that you enjoy more. It should never be a grind. Starting a business, getting to the point where you feel like the only way you can go on is getting somebody else's money to drive your ideas forward. It's a matter of if you're enjoying the activity that underlies it, you're enjoying it, and that's it. It's going to go where it's going to go. If you don't, you're not going to breathe enjoyment or make it more sustainable or breathe life back into it by taking on funding.
And I think honestly, this is, again, now we're like really walking down into like classic tropes here. So I got to be a little careful, but it's like, what is it? Love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life. I mean, it's, again, got to be a little careful because like I just said, a lot of this is a slog and sometimes it's difficult. But if you find the things that you're passionate about, then it's just like, the most successful entrepreneurs I've found are the ones that are like, I just love this thing. And yes, again, don't love doing the accounting, don't necessarily love all the drama that comes with it. There's a bunch of, this, that, and the other thing that comes with it. But like, I'm into the topic, or I'm into what we're building, or I'm into this team. And I think for a lot of people, that is the thing that kind of gets you up every morning. And, it depends on what your thing is. It might be growing coffee beans, or it might be, a van company, or maybe it's I don't know what it's going to be. But I think if you can find the thing, I ask everybody, like, if money wasn't an issue and you could do whatever you wanted, what would you spend your days doing? And the irony is that when you really find that and start to lean into it, you often end up making money because you're passionate about it, you're excited about it, and people can tell, and you read about it, you think about it, like you're finding ways to iterate. And so you inevitably end up kind of creating successful businesses out of it. But, that I think is where the journey should start.
How many people do you meet who, if given the option that money wasn't an option, what do you enjoy spending your time on? They respond to you by trying to convince other people to give me money.
No one.
Yeah, probably no one.
Well, and the funny thing with that question is, because now I've started to make a habit of asking everybody that. And the thing that really amuses me is, in the beginning, I really assumed that everybody would ask me questions or give me answers that were really unattainable. So like, oh, if money was no option, like I would travel the world nonstop, or I'd buy a giant yacht and like sail around the world, or, really expensive, exorbitant things. The irony is people's answers are so mundane. Like people will be like, oh, I'd buy a motorcycle, or like, oh, I would just like only work 3 days a week, or like I'd get a dog. And I'm always just like, then get the dog. Like, it's just, but again, we do this in everything. We do this in business. We do this in our personal lives. We prescribe to like the expectations of what that thing is, what it means to be an entrepreneur, what it means to be successful. And, if you, even if you know that like, oh, all I want to do is run a coffee shop, or all I want to do is run a little local bookstore, if that's not like your expectations of what being an entrepreneur or being successful or even being happy means, then people just ignore it. And so.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So somebody asked, how does the male female experience of starting a business from the ground up differ? I'll let you answer, because I think you would know where I would head. I think it's pretty obvious where I would answer, but I'm curious actually from your perspective.
That is a good question. I think the male experience it's what the process is built for. So in my opinion, business is still very much infused with very male alpha male energy. And the process is built for males who can go out and aggressively sell ideas, rally support, kind of build a team of followers and start executing and just kind of getting out there and being aggressive with it. And I think the male startup experience, I don't know if I can answer from a typical male perspective, but I think it's very different because that mentality, I guess, let's not relate it to my own experience. I think the male experience and the idea that I just laid out, that being an alpha male personality, which is going out, asking people for money, asking people for things, getting people jazzed up, selling, and kind of just building energy that way and just constructing, is a typical way we think about business at its root. And it's a male oriented perspective. So I think it would be very different from a female perspective. And I know, Heidi, you can probably talk about statistics better than me about that the startup space is heavily dominated by males, because it also rewards people who are extremely risk tolerant because of the different things that aspects we've been talking about. You have to kind of put yourself at financial risk. There's not a lot of stability. There's a lot of variability in where your income's coming from and when it's coming. And I think that it's not really aligned to the female personality type at base. I'm sitting here being careful because I don't want to lean on.
No, it's okay. I mean, well, I'll save you for a second. So, I mean, I think I was about to say, there's obviously a clear distinction here where we need to say, like, this isn't necessarily about like gender roles. It's more about like the typical gender phenotypes and, the stereotypes. I think, I mean, again, the data is just, women-owned businesses get less funding. It's a teeny tiny portion of the entrepreneurial world that gets female funding. Also the same for minorities. I think it's something like 5 to 10% of all investment dollars go to female and minority-owned businesses. Now, the caveat to that, and I always thought this was important to point out, in my experience, and I think this is changing, which I love, but it is worth mentioning. Part of that is also because by and large, entrepreneurs tend to be male. So that's also, it's not like there's 50 women, 50 men, and then all 50 men get funding and none of the women get it. Oftentimes when I was in rooms, of the 100 people, 95 of them were men, and then there was 5 of us gals. So I think, it is worth, when you read these statistics about like where the funding goes and stuff, it is important to remember that, again, got to be careful here, because I don't necessarily, I think, you have, to your point, you have lots of women who like have that phenotype of like being very aggressive, very forthright. And then, you have men who are the opposite. But I think traditionally entrepreneurship tends to be more of a male dominated field, because it's a lot of risk taking. It's a lot of being like super forward. It's in some ways very like selfish, because you have to kind of be ultra confident and kind of be like, exactly like you said, I deserve your money. I deserve to be you should be my customer. I think in my experience, myself included, like I shouldn't even say my experience. I'll just speak to my own experience. For me, it was very, very uncomfortable going up and being like, this is going to work. Like, I'm 100% certain that this is going to work, because my brain doesn't work that way. I'm like, I don't know. It might work. I think so. I've done a ton of work, probably much more than my male counterparts. And like, I think this is going to work, but like, can I tell you with 100% certainty that this is going to work? No, I think there's a good chance that it might not work. And as you can imagine, that doesn't make for a super successful investor pitch, because people just want to know, like, I'm going to take your $1 million, I'm going to turn it into $100 million. And even though statistically that almost never happens.
Yeah, the people giving the money too. So you got to look at the mechanics of the people who are driving along young businesses or businesses looking for funding typically are males. Like, how many times did you pitch for females for investment? Probably the
You mean the investors themselves?
Yeah, it's on both sides.
Yes.
Like the
Yes.
private equity, the wealthy individuals who are going out there funding businesses, the people who you need for partnerships to move businesses forward at a young stage. I mean, that's also predominantly males. So like if you're a female entrepreneur or you're a female who's looking for funding, you're also canvassing probably a 95% plus male population.
Yes. And this was, and again, this is where like the entrepreneurs are mostly men. To your point, the rest of the world in the startup space is mostly men. Again, aggressively starting to change, which I love to see. Now there's like, women co-working spaces, there's women investment groups, there's, female, there's female-led everything in this space now. And so it's starting to change. Same thing again for minority-owned businesses. You're starting to see like this rise of all of these resources, but it's relatively novel. Like even since I started in the community, it's relatively novel. And so I think there's a natural implicit bias there in the sense that, if I'm a male investor who started a business, became successful, and now I'm starting to invest, it may even be it's not that you don't like me. It may just be the fact that like in your eyes, we can't, I notice this myself when I judge competitions. It's like, I'll see a young male do, this is mock trial, which is a little bit different, but like I'll see a male play an attorney role, and then I'll see a female play an attorney role. And it's funny. It's like, even if I can objectively say like, oh, that male did a great job, I see myself in the female and I'm like, oh, I remember doing this when I was her age, and like, she's doing a great job. And so there's something inherently like men want to invest in other men because they see themselves in them. And so, again, I think the world is correcting itself and starting to realize like, okay, if we want a more diverse startup space, we have to start going out of our way to include women and minorities and others. And I think in a lot of ways, it leads to a lot more diversity, because I think women actually make fantastic business owners because of everything I just said. They're much more risk averse, and they will like work their tails off, and they'll like double check things 100 times instead of just doing it off of a bunch of, confidence that may or may not be warranted. But a lot of things have to move before women are comfortable and have the resources to step into the space. Yeah.
And I'm ready to come back and give it a round two to articulate some of the thoughts I was saying, just to piggyback of what you were going on, because it's easily to be seen as incendiary with comments when you try to answer the gender differences in business. But I'd say generally, I'm not going to say it's inherently male or female, but mostly more of a commentary on culture in the moment. But a lot of the business process is built on rewarding bravado. And like you said, almost this over embellishment, this over projection of confidence. And it's really a lot of people in business are rewarded not even really on their risk tolerance or their risk aversion or their this or that. It's really just their ability to show up and tell people that things are good and they're going to be okay and get them jazzed up. And it's like showmanship is what drives the process a lot of the time. And I think from a male-female gender role in our current society, men from a very young age are trained and rewarded, even outside the business context, to practice and adopt and nurture that kind of bravado. It's a very much like a male selected trait culturally. Females from a young age are not really encouraged to develop that sort of, overconfident gravitas, because a lot of men find it disarming or they find it unattractive. So there's no incentive from a young age with our current gender dynamics. So when you have females that enter the workforce, I think their experience is different and they're somewhat disadvantaged because I think the truth from my perspective, they tend to be more honest. They tend to be more level-headed. A lot of females I work with in the workforce, they tend to have their first instinct is not to make everything they've done on paper from 100% to 120% and give it that extra oomph. They just tend to be more straightforward and more honest.
Most women will take what they just did as 100% and tell you it was an 80% because they're very careful, which, and men of course go the other direction.
Yeah, they don't want to look cocky. I mean, it's just something that I think women are expected to be more humble in a way than men. And I think then we turn around and kind of find their humility sort of off-putting on a stage where we would expect them to be more aggressive and really pushing their ideas forward with almost a zealous mentality. So there's a lot of differences, and it's tough when I coach female, mentees, employees, people who are just in the competitions that I'm looking at. It is always a sense of I never want to tell them hey, you need to just be out there and give it more, because they're giving the facts. They're saying very calmly what they're trying to do and what they want to achieve. And they're coming at it with an earnestness that I think actually lends itself to fantastic business. But in a way, even for myself, I have a lot of self-awareness, because I get swept up. If their male counterpart gives out there and gives like a crazy show and it's not substantiated by anything but swagger, you still kind of get
Still
stars.
enticing.
Yeah, you're like,
yeah.
well, if I'm giving $1 million to somebody, this guy seems like he's going to make it into $10 million, like you said, and this person just seems like they'll make a solid return, but where's the swag? Where's the like boom, boom, boom? And I don't know. It's our entertainment culture.
Yeah, and I was about to say, and I think the good thing is that instead of, for a long time, women had to compete in that space. And so I think, if you were a woman coming up in the entrepreneurial space, let's say, 30 years ago, you just had to compete on a man's stage. Now, I think that women being involved in this facet, but in every facet, in politics, in, traditional business, in every facet, women are starting to change the dynamic. And I think in a lot of wonderful ways. And I think, to your point, in men and women, things like, unsolicited bravado and, confidence that's unchecked by facts and, all those things are starting to get mitigated, and people are starting to say like, no, I'm okay with someone who's, and I think we're seeing a lot of these changes. I mean, even I think introverted, extroverted is even like a very basic. For years, introverts just got ignored. And now the science is starting to say like, might be important to listen to the introvert on your team, because they actually may know a lot more about what they're doing than the extrovert. And so I think there's a lot of things in business, and, the entrepreneurial space is just a perfect petri dish of it. Of, instead of, again, constantly pushing, to kind of bring it full circle, if the traditional media interpretation of funding is like, you walk into a room, you tell people you're going to make $100 to every $1 they give you, and then they give you $10 million. I would say just as unrealistic as getting handed $100 million is, that type of a pitch is also becoming outdated. And so I think what people are looking for, even if you were to go down a funding route, which again is very, very unlikely and almost never happens anymore. But even if you are, I think people are now looking for, everything in the lean business model. They want to see that you've interacted with the market. They want to see that you have data. They want to see that you're having returns. They want to see that you put in the work. And so I think, in that space, women actually can do a lot of, can have a lot of success. So it's kind of interesting to see all the dynamics shifting.
Well, and men too. I can be better at success at tempering themselves. I think this really, for me, this conversation is culminating in this idea that it's all comes back to honesty. Generally, being honest with what you're trying to do, how you're going to do it, and just being more honest. And really, if we're talking about funding as a central theme here, I would posit that a lot of funding activities are dishonest, and they're expected to be dishonest in a way, and they're dishonest from start to finish. They're dishonest in the sense that you need this money for a certain thing. They're dishonest in how you sell people or get them excited to give it to you. And then there's a lot of dishonesty in how it's used and how it's applied and what the results are made to look. And, we could go on for hours about how that actually looks in practice. But I think in a more honest system where everyone is really just embodying truth about what they're trying to do, how they're going to do it, what they need right now, not what they need to get to $1 zillion in 6 months or 2 years or have outsized returns, but what they need now. The entire funding culture that I think we've come to know over the last few decades wouldn't really have any legs to stand on, because as you said, Heidi, it's not really an honest conversation when you say, give me your $1 million and I'll make it $1 zillion because I have this crazy idea. And the numbers are coming back. The Silicon Valley craze is weakening because investors were throwing money at that stuff and it was just evaporating into nothing. Like the returns aren't there a lot of the time.
A lot of the time, yeah. And I mean, again, for every, investor that hit it once, one investment turned into $1,000 and the other 99 failed, nobody ever talks about the 99. And so to your point about the honesty, I think anybody who's thinking about this journey, just make sure that you're really not only being honest, to Sam's point, about what you need and what you're looking for and, when you interact with the community, but also make sure the community is being honest with you. I mean, when, if you are going to talk to funders, what's your success rate? What's your expected return? The amount of people who I wasted time talking for hours and hours and hours. And the reality was they weren't even vaguely interested in investing or didn't even have the capability to invest. I think, like Sam said, if you could just start the conversation much more honestly on both sides, you'd save yourself a lot of time. So it's going to be a much healthier ecosystem.
Agreed. And I'll try to end with another analogy.
Not more churning butter.
Not more butter. We're gonna set the butter aside. I like garden analogies, so let's end with that. If a gardener came and told you, I just planted a bunch of seeds in the ground, and they tried to sell you on giving them 1,000 pounds of fertilizer to make the result better, just be wary on both sides of that conversation is all I'm saying. And hopefully that evokes something in you guys that are listening, because there are a lot of times in life and in business where you can't cheat the energy. You got to make it. You got to make the energy somewhere. The seeds aren't going to grow. The whole garden is not going to grow as only fast as it can. Some fertilizer might help for a little bit, but I guarantee that if you give them the 1,000 pounds of fertilizer, they're going to throw it on the ground somewhere, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences. So, but the seeds can only grow so fast, and you got to really think about what does that trajectory look like? What is the max capacity that a business could have to grow? What can you actually receive and put to good use? And a lot of it, I guess, it's just another conversation about honesty at the end of the day. So I think that'd be my closing thoughts on the topic. If you're thinking about funding, just be really honest with it. Anything else for anybody?
No. I think we probably scared everybody off from being an entrepreneur and hopefully made it equally enticing all in the same 40 minutes.
That's always how it goes. All right. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.